Concerning a Steeplechase Rider by A.B. Paterson. Coffee Break Collection 38. Horses. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Merritt. Concerning a Steeplechase Rider. Of all the ways in which men get a living, there is none so hard and so precarious as that of steeplechase riding in Australia. It is bad enough in England, where steeplechases only take place in winter, when the ground is soft, where the horses are properly schooled before being raced, and where most of the obstacles will yield a little if struck and give the horse a chance to blunder over safely. In Australia, the men have to go at racing speed on very hard ground over the most rigid and uncompromising obstacles. Iron bark rails clamped into solid posts with bands of iron. No wonder they are always coming to grief, and are always in and out of hospital in splints and bandages. Sometimes one reads that a horse has fallen and the rider has escaped with a severe shaking. That shaking, gentle reader, would lay you or me up for weeks, with a doctor to look after us and a crowd of sympathetic friends calling to know how our poor back was. But the steeplechase rider has to be out and about again, riding exercise every morning, and schooling all sorts of cantankerous brutes over the fences. These men take their lives in their hands and look at grim death between their horses' ears every time they race or school. The death record among Australian cross-country jockeys and horses is very great. It is a curious instance of how custom sanctifies all things, that such horse and man slaughter is accepted in such a callous way. If any theater gave a show at which men and horses were habitually crippled or killed in full sight of the audience, the manager would be put on his trial for manslaughter. Our racetracks use up their yearly average of horses and men without attracting remark. One would suppose that the risk being so great, the profits were enormous, but they are not. In the game, as played on our race courses, there is just a bare living for a good, capable horseman while he lasts, with the certainty of an ugly smash if he keeps at it long enough. And they don't need to keep at it very long. After a few good shakings, they begin to take a nip or two, to put heart into them before they go out. And after a while, they have to increase the dose. At last, they cannot ride at all without a regular cargo of alcohol on board, and are either half muzzy or shaky, according as they have taken too much or too little. Then the game becomes suicidal. It is an axiom that as soon as a man begins to funk, he begins to fall. The reason is that a rider who has lost his nerve is afraid of his horse making a mistake and takes a pull or urges him onward, just at the crucial moment when the horse is rattling up to his fence and judging his distance. That little nervous pull at his head, or that little touch of the spur, takes his attention from the fence, with the result that he makes his spring a foot too far off or a foot too close in, and smash. The loafers who hang about the big fences rush up to see if the jockey is killed or stunned. If he is, they dispose of any jewelry he may have about him. They have been known to almost tear a finger off in their endeavors to secure a ring. The ambulance clatters up at a canter. The poor rider is pushed in out of sight, and the ladies in the stand say how unlucky they are, that brute of a horse falling after they backed him. A wolfish-eyed man in the ledger stand shouts to a wolfish-eyed pal, "Bill, I believe that jock was killed when the chestnut fell." And Bill replies, "Yes, damn him, and I had 5 bob on him." And the rider, gasping like a crushed chicken, is carried into the casualty room and laid on a little stretcher, while outside the window the bookmakers are roaring, 4-1, bar 1, and the racing is going on merrily as ever. These remarks serve to introduce one of the fraternity who may be considered as typical of all. He was a small, wiry, hard-featured fellow, the son of a stockman on a big cattle station, and began life as a horsebreaker. He was naturally a horseman, able and willing to ride anything that could carry him. He left the station to go with cattle on the road, and having picked up a horse that showed pace, amused himself by jumping over fences. Then he went to Wagga, entered the horse in a steeplechase, rode him himself, won handsomely, sold the horse at a good price to a Sydney buyer, and went down to ride it in his Sydney races. In Sydney he did very well. He got a name as a fearless and clever rider, and was offered several mounts on fine animals. So he pitched his camp in Sydney, and became a fully enrolled member of the worst profession in the world. I had known him in the old days on the road, and when I met him on the course one day, I inquired how he liked his new life. "Well, it's a living," he said, "but it's no great shakes. They don't give steeplechase riders a chance in Sydney. There's very few races, and the big sweepstakes keep horses out of the game." "Do you get a fair share of the riding?" I asked. "Oh, yes. I get as much as anybody. But there's a lot of 'em got a notion I won't take hold of a horse when I'm told, i.e., pull him, to prevent him winning. Some of these days I'll take hold of a horse when they don't expect it." I smiled as I thought there was probably a sorry day in store for some backer when the jockey took hold unexpectedly. "Do you have to pull horses then to get employment?" "Oh, well, it's this way," he said, rather apologetically. "If an owner is badly treated by the handicapper and is just giving his horse a run to get weight off, then it's right enough to catch hold a bit. But when a horse is favorite and the public are backing him, it isn't right to take hold of him then. I would not do it." This was his whole code of morals, not to pull a favorite, and he felt himself very superior to the scoundrel who would pull favorites or outsiders indiscriminately. "What do you get for riding?" I asked him. "Well," he said, looking about uneasily, "we're supposed to get a $5 for a losing mount, and £10 if we win. But a lot of the steeplechase owners are what I call battlers. Men who have no money and get along by owing everybody. They promise us all sorts of money if we win, but they don't pay if we lose. I only got £2 for that last steeplechase." £2? I made a rapid calculation. He had ridden over 18 fences for £2, had chanced his life 18 times at less than half a crown a time. "Good heavens," I said, "that's a poor game. Wouldn't you be better back on the station?" "Oh, I don't know. Sometimes we get laid a bit to nothing and do well out of a race. And then, you know, a steeplechase rider is somebody, not like an ordinary fellow that is just working." I realized that I was an ordinary fellow who was just working, and felt small accordingly. "I'm just off to Way now," he said. "I'm riding contractor, and he'll run well, but he always seems to fall at those logs. Still, I ought to have luck today. I met a hearse as I was coming out. I'll get him over the fences somehow." "Do you think it lucky, then, to meet a hearse?" "Oh, yes," he said. "If you meet it, you mustn't overtake it. That's unlucky." "So is a cross-eyed man unlucky. Cross-eyed men ought to be kept off racecourses." He reappeared clad in his racing rig, and we set off to see the horse saddled. We found the owner in a great state of excitement. It seemed he had no money, absolutely none whatever, but had borrowed enough to pay the sweepstakes and stood to make something if the horse won and lose nothing if he lost, as he had nothing to lose. My friend insisted on being paid £2 before he would mount, and the owner nearly had a fit in his efforts to persuade him to ride on credit. At last the backer of the horse agreed to pay £2 10 win or lose, and the rider was to get £25 out of the prize if he won. So up he got, and as he and the others walked the big muscular horses round the ring, nodding gaily to friends in the crowd, I thought of the gladiators going out to fight in the arena with the cry of "Hail Caesar! Those about to die salute thee." The story of the race is soon told. My friend went to the front at the start and led nearly all the way, and "Contractor" was on everyone's lips as the big horse sailed along in front of his field. He came at the log fence full of running, and it looked certain that he would get over, but at the last stride he seemed to falter, then plunged right into the fence, striking it with his chest, and, turning right over, landed on his unfortunate rider. A crowd clustered round and hid horse and rider from view, and I ran down to the casualty room to meet him when the ambulance came in. The limp form was carefully taken out and laid on a stretcher while a doctor examined the crushed ribs, the broken arm, and all the havoc that the horse's huge weight had wrought. There was no hope from the first. My poor friend, who had so often faced death for £2, lay very still a while. Then he began to talk, wandering in his mind. "Where are the cattle?" His mind evidently going back to the old days on the road. Then quickly, "Look out there, give me room." And again, £25, Mary, and a sure thing if he don't fall at the logs." Mary was sobbing beside the bed, cursing the fence and the money that had brought him to grief. At last, in a tone of satisfaction, he said, quite clear and loud, "I know how it was. There couldn't have been any dead man in that hearse." And so, having solved the mystery to his own satisfaction, he drifted away into unconsciousness and woke somewhere on the other side of the big fence that we can neither see through nor over, but all have to face sooner or later. And of Concerning a Steeplechase Rider by A.B. Paterson.
The Fox and the Horse by Jacob Grimm and Wilhelm Grimm. Coffee Break Collection 38. Horses. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Winnifred Assmann. The Fox and the Horse. A peasant once had a faithful horse, but it had grown old and could no longer do its work. Its master grudged it food and said, "I can't use you any more, but I still feel kindly towards you, and if you show yourself strong enough to bring me a lion, I will keep you to the end of your days. But away with you now, out of my stable." And he drove it out into the open country. The poor horse was very sad, and went into the forest to get a little shelter from the wind and weather. There he met a fox, who said, "Why do you hang your head and wander about in this solitary fashion?" "Alas," answered the horse, "avarice and honesty cannot live together. My master has forgotten all the service I have done him for these many years, and because I can no longer plough, he will no longer feed me, and he has driven me away." "Without any consideration?" asked the fox. "Only the poor consolation of telling me that if I was strong enough to bring him a lion, he would keep me. but he knows well enough that the task is beyond me." The fox said, "But I will help you. Just you lie down here and stretch your legs out as if you were dead." The horse did as he was told, and the fox went to the lion's den, not far off, and said, "There is a dead horse out there. Come along with me, and you will have a rare meal." The lion went with him, and when they got up to the horse, the fox said, "You can't eat it in comfort here. I'll tell you what. I will tie it to you, and you can drag it away to your den and enjoy it at your leisure." The plan pleased the lion, and he stood quite still, close to the horse, so that the fox should fasten them together. But the fox tied the lion's legs together with the horse's tail, and twisted and knotted it so that it would be quite impossible for it to come undone. When he had finished his work, he patted the horse on the shoulder and said, "Pull, old Grey, pull." Then the horse sprang up and dragged the lion away behind him. The lion in his rage roared, so that all the birds in the forest were terrified and flew away. But the horse let him roar, and never stopped till he stood before his master's door. When the master saw him, he was delighted, and said to him, "You shall stay with me, and have a good time as long as you live." And he fed him well till he died. End of The Fox and the Horse, by Jacob Grimm and Wilhelm Grimm. The Horseback Ride, by Sarah Jane Lippincott. Pen name, Grace Greenwood. Coffee Break Collection 38. Horses. The Horseback Ride. When troubled in spirit, when weary of life, when I faint 'neath its burdens and shrink from its strife, when its fruits turned to ashes are mocking my taste, and its fairest scene seems but a desolate waste, then come ye not near me, my sad heart to cheer with friendship's soft accents or sympathy's tear. No pity I ask, and no counsel I need, but bring me, oh bring me my gallant young steed, with his high arched neck and his nostrils spread wide, his eye full of fire and his step full of pride. As I spring to his back, as I seize the strong rein, the strength to my spirit returneth again. The bonds are all broken that fettered my mind, and my cares borne away on the wings of the wind. My pride lifts its head, for a season bowed down, and the queen in my nature now puts on her crown. Now we're off, like the winds to the plains whence they came, and the rapture of motion is thrilling my frame. On, speeds my courser, scarce printing the sod, scarce crushing a daisy to mark where he trod. On like a deer, when the hound's early bay awakes the wild echoes, away and away. Still faster, still farther, he leaps at my cheer, till the rush of the startled air whirs in my ear. Now long a clear rivulet lieth his track, see his glancing hoofs tossing the white pebbles back. Now a glen dark as midnight, what matter, we'll down, though shadows are round us and rocks o'er us frown. The thick branches shake as we're hurrying through, and deck us with spangles of silvery dew. What a wild thought of triumph, that this girlish hand such a steed in the might of his strength may command. What a glorious creature! Ah, glance at him now, as I check him a while on this green hillock's brow. How he tosses his mane with a shrill, joyous neigh, and paws the firm earth in his proud, stately play. Hurrah! Off again, dashing on as in ire, till the long flinty pathway is flashing with fire. Ho, a ditch! Shall we pause? No, the bold leap we dare. Like a swift winged arrow we rush through the air. Oh, not all the pleasures that poets may praise, not the wildering waltz in the ballroom's blaze, nor the chivalrous joust, nor the daring race, nor the swift regatta, nor merry chase, nor the sail high-heaving waters o'er, nor the rural dance on the moonlight shore, can the wild and thrilling joy exceed of a fearless leap on a fiery steed. End of The Horseback Ride, by Sarah Jane Lippincott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
Horse, Mule, or Burro for the Trail by Stewart Edward White. Coffee Break Collection 38, Horses. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ted Lienhart at centurypast.org. Horse, Mule, or Burro for the Trail. Mules. A good riding mule, when you can get him, and provided you intend to use him only for trail travel in the mountains, is about the best proposition. A mule is more sure-footed than a horse, and can subsist where a horse would starve. On the other hand, he is not much good off a walk, never acquires the horse's interest in getting around stubborn stock, and is apt to be mean. None of these objections, however much they may influence your decision as to saddle animals, will have any weight against a pack beast. For the latter purpose, the mule is unexcelled, but probably in the long run you will prefer to ride a horse. Burros. Burros are an aggravation, and yet in some circumstances they are hard to beat. They are unbelievably slow and unbelievably stubborn. When they get tired, or think they do, they stop, and urging merely confirms their decision to rest. You cannot hurry them. They hate water, and it is sometimes next to impossible to force them into a deep or swift stream. They are camp thieves, and will eat anything left within their reach. Still, they can live on sagebrush, go incredible periods without drinking, make their way through country impassable to any other hoofed animals excepting goats and sheep. Certain kinds of desert travel are impossible without them, and some rough mountaineering is practicable only with their aid. At times, you will be driven to the use of them. In such an emergency, gird your soul with patience and buy big ones. Pack mules are almost impossible to get and are generally very high priced. A good pack mule does not mean any good mule that comes along. The animal should be rather small, chunkily built, gentle as to the heels and teeth, accustomed to carrying and taking care of a pack, trained to follow the saddle horses, and not inclined to stray from camp. Such perfection costs anywhere from $75 to $150. It is worth the price to one who does much packing, but as perfectly adequate pack horses can be had for from $20 to $40 and are easy to find, you will in all likelihood choose them. Choosing a horse. Now I know perfectly well that I can tell you nothing about choosing a horse. If you are a New Englander, you will know all about the trade. If you are a New Yorker, you could give me points on every horse in the ring. If you are Middle West, you probably have raced or worked or traded or raised more horses than I will ever ride. But in selecting a mountain horse, his mere points as a physical specimen are often little in his favor, while glaring defects may concern his usefulness hardly at all. Never mind, at first, how the horse offered for your inspection looks. Examine him for blemishes later. You must first discover if he is sure-footed and courageous. An Eastern horse would not last 5 minutes on a Western trail. A Western horse, no matter how accustomed to mountain work, is worse than useless if subject to ordinary horse panics as suddenly rustling leaves, unexpected black stubs, and the like. He must attend to his footing, keep his eyes for the trail, and be wise. Next, you must inquire if this steadiness carries over into other things. He must stand when left without hitching, and must be easy to catch. Often you will have to dismount for the purpose of clearing trail, helping the pack train, tightening ropes, or reconnoitering. At such junctures, iron hitching posts are not always at hand. Nothing is more aggravating than the necessity of searching everywhere for a place to tie, or worse, to be forced to chase down and coax quiet a horse that is promptly decamped when left for a moment to himself. Nor does it add to your joy to get up at 4 for the purpose of making an early start, only to spend the extra hour filched from sleep in an attempt to catch some snorting fool horse. The picture I have sketched looks to you somewhat like what is known as an old cow, doesn't it? But in reality, good horses of the quality named are not difficult to find. Equine intelligence is of a higher grade west than east, mainly because a Western horse is all his life thrown on his own resources. It is perfectly possible to find a horse both handsome and spirited, which will nevertheless permit himself to be directly approached in pasture and will stand until further orders on the trail. But the point is that it is much better, infinitely, to get an old cow than a horse without these qualities. The old cow will carry you and will be there when wanted. That is the main thing in the mountains. While as for the other horse, no matter how well bred he is, how spirited, how well gaited, how handsome, how appealing in every way to a horseman's eye, he will be worse than no horse if you have to keep your hands on him, if he must be picketed at night, if he is likely to shy on a bad trail, if he may refuse to tackle a rough place or to swim a river. Of course, it is nice to ride a good-looking horse, but in the mountains, most emphatically, handsome is what handsome does. The horses I now own are fine animals and fine mountain ponies, but some of the best I have ever ridden a horseman would not look at twice. On a time, being under the absolute necessity of getting a pack quickly, I purchased a bay that I promptly named Methuselah. He was some 16 years old, badly stove forward by hard riding, and not much of a horse anyway. For 3 months he carried a pack. Then one day I threw a saddle on him to go a short distance on some little errand. Methuselah, overjoyed, did his best. The old horse was one of the best mountain saddlers in the outfit. He climbed surely and well. He used his head in negotiating bad places, would stay where he was put. The fact that he was not sound was utterly unimportant, for not once in a week was he required to go faster than a walk. On the other hand, I once owned a bill horse, mountain-bred and raised. He was a beautiful beast, proud, high-stepping, one you would be glad to be seen on. He would have been worth considerable money and would have afforded much solid satisfaction if I had wanted him for cow work or pleasure riding in the lower country. But it was absolutely impossible to catch him, even hobbled, without a corral. One day I saw him leap from a stand, and with hobbles, over a fence and feed trough. So I traded him for another, not nearly so much of a horse as a horse, but worth 24 bill horses. Gun shyness. One other thing you must notice, and that is whether or not the beast is gun shy. A great many stampede wildly at the report of firearms. I once owned a pack horse named Sam Fat, on which for some time I congratulated myself. He was a heavy animal and could carry a tremendous load, and yet he was sure-footed and handled himself well on rough country. He was gentle and friendly. He took perfect care of his pack, and he followed perfectly. No one needed to ride behind him to keep Sam Fat coming. I used to turn him loose when I started and pay no more attention to him until I stopped. No matter how rich the feed through which we passed, Sam Fat was always on hand when the halt was called. And very important point, he was a good rustler. He kept fat and sleek on poor feed when other horses gaunted. Altogether, Sam Fat was a find. Then one day, one of the party shot off a harmless little .22 caliber pop gun. Sam Fat went crazy. He squatted flat, uttered a terrified squeal, and departed through the woods, banging his pack against trees and hanging limbs. We chased him a mile, and finally brought him back, but all the rest of the day he was panicky. I tried to get him accustomed to shooting by tying him near our target practice, but it was no use. Finally, though reluctantly, I sold him. So when the natives bring in their horses for your selection, blind your eyes to the question of looks and points until you have divided the offering into 2 parts, those that are sure-footed, courageous, gentle, tractable, easy to catch, good grub rustlers, and if pack horses, those that will follow and take care of their packs, and those that lack one or more of these qualifications. Discard the second group. Then, if the first group contains nothing but blemished or homely horses, make the best of it, perfectly sure that the others might as well not exist. Qualifications. In general, a horse just from pasture should have a big belly. A small-bellied horse will prove to be a poor feeder and will probably weaken down on a long hike. The best horse stands from 14 hands to 14.2 and is chunkily built. There are exceptions, both ways, to this rule. A pack horse is better with low withers on account of the possibility of sore backs. Avoid a horse whose ears hang sidewise from his head. He is apt to be stubborn. As for the rest, horse sense is the same everywhere. What a horse should carry. A pack horse can carry 200 pounds, not more. Of course, more can be piled on him, and he will stand up under it, but on a long trip he will deteriorate. Greater weights are carried only in textbooks and campfire lies and where a regular pack route permits of grain feeding. A good animal, with care, will take 200 successfully enough, but I personally always pack much lighter. Feed costs nothing, so it is every bit as cheap to take 3 horses as 2. The only expense is the slight bother of packing an extra animal. In return, you can travel farther and more steadily. The chances of sore backs are minimized. Your animals keep fat and strong, and in case one meets with an accident, you can still save all your effects on the other. For the last 3 years, I have made it a practice to pack only about 100 to 125 pounds when off for a very long trip. My animals have always come out fat and hearty, sometimes in marked contrast to those of my companions, and I have not had a single case of sore back. Sore backs. The latter are best treated by Bickmore's gall cure. Its use does not interfere in the least with packing, and I have never seen a case it did not cure inside 10 days or 2 weeks. How far a horse should travel. In the mountains and on grass feed, 20 miles a day is big travel. If you push more than that, you are living beyond your income. It is much better, if you are moving every day, to confine yourself to jaunts of from 12 to 15 miles on an average. Then, if necessity arises, you have something to fall back on and are able to make a forced march. Mountain travel. The distance may seem very short to you if you have never traveled in the mountains, but as a matter of fact, you will probably find it quite sufficient, both in length of time and in variety of scenery. To cover it, you will travel steadily for from 6 to 8 hours, and in the diversity of country will be interested every step of the way. Indeed, so varied will be the details that it will probably be difficult to believe you have made so small a mileage until you stop to reflect that, climbing and resting, no horse can go faster than 2 or 2 1/2 miles an hour. Desert travel. On the desert or the plains, the length of your journey must depend entirely on the sort of feed you can get. 30 miles a day for a long period is all a fed horse can do, while 20 is plenty enough for an animal depending on his own foraging. Longer rides are not to be considered in the course of regular travel. I once did 180 miles in 2 days, and then took a rest. Time to travel. In the mountains, you must keep in mind that a horse must both eat and rest, and that he will not graze when frost is on the meadows. Many otherwise skillful mountaineers ride until nearly dark, and are up and off soon after daylight. They wonder why their horses lose flesh and strength. The truth is, the poor beasts must compress their 24 hours of sustenance into the short noon stop, and the shorter evening before the frost falls. It is often much wiser to get a very early start, to travel until the middle of the afternoon, and then to go into camp. Whatever inconvenience and discomfort you may suffer is more than made up for by the opportunities to hunt, fish, or cook afforded by the early stop, and the time you imagine you lose is regained in the long run by the regularity of your day's journeys. On the desert or the plains, where it is hot, to the contrary, you will have better luck by traveling early and late. Desert journeying is uncomfortable anyway, but has its compensations. We ordinarily get underway by 3 in the morning, keep going until 9, start about 6 again, after supper, and travel until 9 of the evening. Thus we take advantage of whatever coolness is possible and see the rising and the falling of the day, which is the most wonderful and beautiful of the desert's gifts. Climbing. Going up steep hills in high altitudes, you must breathe your horse every 50 feet or so. It need not be a long rest. Merely rein him in for 8 or 10 seconds. Do the same thing always before entering the negotiation of a bad place in the trail. Do this no matter how fresh and eager your animal may seem. Often it spells the difference between a stumble and a good, clean climb. An experienced pack horse will take these rests on his own initiative, stopping and also starting again with a regularity of clockwork. It does not hurt a horse to sweat, but if ever he begins to drip heavily and to tremble in the legs, it is getting time to hunt the shade for a rest. I realize that such minor points as these may be perfectly well known to everyone likely to read these articles, and yet I have seen so many cases of ignorance of them on the trail that I risk their inclusion here. Unsaddling. Every hour or two, loosen the cinches of your saddle horse and raise the saddle and blankets an inch or so to permit a current of air to pass through. Steaming makes the back tender. When you unsaddle him or the pack animals, if they are very hot, leave the blankets across them for a few moments. A hot sun shining on a sweaty back causes small pimples which may develop into sores. It is better to bathe with cold water the backs of green horses, but such a trouble is not necessary after they are hardened. To pick up a horse's feet. 2 more things I will mention, though strictly speaking they do not fall in the province of equipment articles. When you pick up a horse's hind foot, face to the rear, put the hand nearest the horse firmly against his flank and use the other to raise the hoof. Then if he tries to kick, you can hold him off sufficiently to get out of the way. Indeed, the very force of his movement toward you will thrust against the hand on his flank and tend to throw you to one side. To mount a bad horse. If you are called upon to mount a bad horse, seize the cheek piece of his bridle in your left hand and twist his head sharply toward you. At the same time, grasp the pommel in your right hand, thrust your foot in the stirrup, and swing aboard. Never get on any Western horse as an Easterner mounts, left hand on pommel and right hand on cantle. If a horse plunges forward to buck while you are in this position, you will inevitably land back of the saddle. Then he has a fine leverage to throw you about 40 feet. A bad pack horse you can handle by blindfolding. Anchor things for a storm, take off the bandage, and stand one side. End of horse, mule, or burro for the trail.
Horse Breeding and Horse Racing by J.C. Ewart. Coffee Break Collection 38. Horses. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Horse Breeding and Horse Racing. The history of the English racehorse is a checkered one. During the Wars of the Roses, many studs were dispersed, but owing to the re-importation of horses from the continent during the reign of Henry VIII, the thoroughbred breed was re-established. Later, owing to the importation of numerous Oriental and other alien stallions and mares, the English breed of racehorses was for years in the melting pot. In 1649, the Royal Tutbury stud was handed over to Parliament, but a few years later Cromwell, though himself an owner of racehorses, found it necessary, quote, for political reasons, end quote, to stop racing. History has been repeating itself. A valuable stud has recently been handed over to the government, and racing has once again been virtually suspended. Further, some people not unduly biased by the objectionable features of race meetings are asking, quote, is racing necessary to maintain the preeminence of the English racehorse, end quote, while others, including Sir H. Johnston, want to know, quote, whether the type of horse that has evolved from horse racing is of any use nowadays, end quote. It is well to bear in mind that the racehorse industry is a large and important one, and that the large sums received for horses exported help to pay for the raw material required for our cotton and other factories. But there is a more cogent reason than the economic one for preserving the racehorse. Unless we intend to retire once more to the fool's paradise we found so comfortable up to August 1914, it is essential that we not only preserve the thoroughbred, but also, by more scientific breeding, add greatly to its value for military and other purposes. Light as well as heavy horses have played an important part in the present war, and, notwithstanding mechanical traction, they may play a still more important part in future wars. Horses for military purposes should have the vigor, staying power, and tenacity of mules combined with the cross-country instincts of hunters. Such horses can be obtained only by crossbreeding. It would be difficult to create and maintain a breed of hunters, and still more difficult to create breeds of the old pack horse type suitable for military purposes. This being the case, it will continue to be impossible to provide army horses without the help of the thoroughbred. The modern English racehorse is said to be, quote, more remarkable for speed than stamina, end quote. Nevertheless, crosses having a large infusion of thoroughbred blood have often as much staying power, intelligence, and courage as Arabs. Hitherto, while continental powers have been spending annually large sums in breeding, or providing facilities for breeding, military horses, our Army Remount Department has looked to thoroughbred and other breeders to provide them with all the different types of service horses required, has in fact trusted to meet the demands of the Army by misfits obtained at a price which scarcely paid for their upbringing. Many who realize the national importance of maintaining the English and Irish racehorses have some difficulty in realizing that racehorse breeding implies racing. They admit that it is impossible to create and maintain herds of, quote, 1,000-gallon cows, end quote, without keeping milk records, and that unless records are kept, it is impossible to have strains of, quote, 200-egg hens, end quote. But they fail to appreciate the importance of having continuous records giving the performance of racehorses. It is impossible by looking at or handling a cow to say whether or not her offspring will prove as good milkers as her pedigree suggests, for everything depends on the contents of the germ cells, and the only way to obtain information about the composition of the germ cells is to test the milking powers of the offspring. When a thoroughbred stallion has a distinguished racing record, there is a probability that he will prove a successful sire, but the only sure test is the performance of his offspring. As thoroughbreds are an unstable blend of several distinct types, they rarely breed true. Hence, breeders in selecting stallions should be guided mainly by the racing records of their offspring. Sometimes indifferent performers acquire great distinction at the stud. Stockwell is said to have achieved at the stud, quote, the most brilliant success of any sire of all time, end quote, and he is often referred to as the Emperor of Stallions. The sire of Stockwell, the Baron, was the son of the very unattractive, fiddle-headed Mare, Echidna, who was never saddled. Stockwell's dam, Pocahontas, was a bad roarer and an indifferent performer on the turf and deficient in quality, yet Pocahontas, through Stockwell, Rataplan, King Tom, and others who inherited her immense vitality, did much to increase the stamina of the modern English racehorse. But for the racing test, the value of the Pocahontas and Echidna blood would never have been realized. The necessity of testing the speed, endurance, etc. of possible sires was first realized about the beginning of the 17th century, but the importance of directing more attention to the performance of the offspring than to that of either sire or dam is not yet sufficiently recognized. During a considerable part of the last century, the practice of considering almost exclusively the records of the sire did little harm, because, as Osborne points out in his Horse Breeder's Handbook, in former times 1 out of every 3 horses bred could win a race. But since the 80s, it is doubtful if more than 1 in 20 of the horses bred has won a race. That a change has taken place since it became the fashion to have large sales of yearlings is supported by Sir Walter Gilby, who in 1898 pointed out that 22 yearlings, sold in 1895 for 46,200 guineas, only won 3 races in 1897 worth 1,080 shillings, and that 22, sold for 34,850 guineas as yearlings in 1894, had failed when their racing career was nearly over to earn 1/2 of what they originally cost. Obviously, if only about 5% of the racehorses bred have the speed and endurance required to win a race, it is important that facilities should be provided for systematically testing young horses as soon as their training is sufficiently advanced. Breeding racehorses without applying racing tests is bound to lead to deterioration. For this reason, the continuance of such racing as may be required to test the value of stallions and mares now at stud is essential. End of Horse Breeding and Horse Racing by J.C. Ewart. Recording by Elsie Selwyn.
If Wishes Were Horses by Nancy Beard Turner. Coffee Break Collection 38. Horses. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. If wishes for horses for just one day, oh my dear, what a wild stampede, gray and sorrel and brown and bay, for every wisher a splendid steed, black for us too, with the wind in his mane, and a star in his forehead as white as snow, silver stirrups and scarlet rein. I'd fling you up to the saddle bow, sparks would fly from his flashing feet, slivers of light as the road uncurled, and we'd ride to the end of the world, my sweet, we'd ride to the end of the world. End of If Wishes Were Horses by Nancy Beard Turner. Recording by Xander Webb. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
In the Droving Days by Banjo Paterson. Coffee Break Collection 38. Horses. "Only a pound," said the auctioneer. "Only a pound, and I'm standing here selling this animal, gain or loss. Only a pound for the drover's horse, one of the sort that was never afraid. One of the boys of the old brigade. Thoroughly honest and game, I'll swear. Only a little the worse for wear. Plenty as bad as to be seen in town. Give me a bid, and I'll knock him down. Sold as he stands, and without recourse. Give me a bid for the drover's horse." Loitering there in an aimless way, somehow I noticed the poor old grey. Weary and battered and screwed, of course. Yet when I noticed the old grey horse, the rough bush saddle, and single rein of the bridle laid on his tangled mane, straightway the crowd and the auctioneer seemed on a sudden to disappear, melted away in a kind of haze, for my heart went back to the droving days. Back to the road, and I crossed again over the miles of the saltbush plain, the shining plain that is said to be the dried-up bed of an inland sea, where the air so dry and so clear and bright refracts the sun with a wondrous light, and out in the dim horizon makes the deep blue gleam of the phantom lakes. At dawn of day we would feel the breeze that stirred the boughs of the sleeping trees, and brought a breath of the fragrance rare that comes and goes in that scented air. For the trees and grass and shrubs contain a dry sweet scent on the saltbush plain. For those that love it and understand, the saltbush plain is a wonderland, a wondrous country, where nature's ways were revealed to me in the droving days. We saw the fleet wild horses pass, and the kangaroos through the Mitchell grass. The emu ran with her frightened brood, all unmolested and unpursued. But there rose a shout and a wild hubbub when the dingo raced for his native scrub, and he paid right dear for his stolen meals with the drover's dogs at his wretched heels. For we ran him down at a rattling pace, while the pack-horse joined in the stirring chase, and a wild halloo at the kill we'd raise. We were light of heart in the droving days. 'Twas a drover's horse, and my hand again made a move to close on a fancied rein, for I felt the swing and the easy stride of the grand old horse that I used to ride, in drought or plenty, in good or ill. That same old steed was my comrade still. The old grey horse with his honest ways was a mate to me in the droving days. When we kept our watch in the cold and damp, if the cattle broke from the sleeping camp, over the flats and across the plain, with my head bent down on his waving mane, through the boughs above and the stumps below, on the darkest night I could let him go at a racing speed. He would choose his course, and my life was safe with the old grey horse. But man and horse had a favourite job, when an outlaw broke from a station mob. With a right good will was the stock whip plied, as the old horse raced at the straggler's side, and the greenhide whip such a wheel would raise, we could use the whip in the droving days. Only a pound! And was this the end? Only a pound for the drover's friend? The drover's friend that had seen his day, and now was worthless, and cast away with a broken knee and a broken heart, to be flogged and starved in a hawker's cart. Well, I made a bid for a sense of shame, and the memories dear of the good old game. Thank you. Guinea, and shape at that. Against you there in the curly hat. Only a guinea and one more chance. Down he goes if there's no advance. Third, and the last time, 1, 2, 3. And the old grey horse was knocked down to me. And now he's wandering, fat and sleek, on the Lucerne flats by the Homestead Creek. I dare not ride him for fear he'd fall, but he does a journey to beat them all. Although he scarcely a trot can raise, he can take me back to the droving days. End of In the Droving Days by Banjo Paterson. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Algy Pug. Mulligan's Mare by Banjo Paterson. Coffee Break Collection 38. Horses. Oh, Mulligan's Bar was the deuce of a place to drink and to fight, and to gamble and race. The height of choice spirits from near and from far were all concentrated on Mulligan's Bar. There was Jerry the Swell, and the jockey boy, Ned, Dog Bite Me, so called from the shape of his head, and a man whom the boys, in a musical slang, designed as the gaffer of Mulligan's gang. Now Mulligan's gang had a racer to show, a bad 'un to look at, a good 'un to go. Whenever they backed her, you safely might swear she'd walk in a winner, would Mulligan's mare. But Mulligan, having some radical views, neglected his business and got on the booze. He took up with runners, a treacherous troop, who gave him away, and he fell in the soup. And so it turned out, on a fine summer day, a bailiff turned up with a writ of fee-far. He walked to the bar with a manner serene. "I levy," said he, "in the name of the Queen." Then Mulligan wanted, in spite of the law, to pay out the bailiff with one on the jaw. He drew out to hit him, but ere you could wink, he changed his intentions, and stood him a drink. A great consultation there straightway befell, 'twixt jockey boy Neddy and a Jerry the Swell, and the man with the head, who remarked, "Why, you bet, Dog Bite Me," said he, "but we'll diddle them yet. We'll slip out the mare from her stall in a crack, and put in her place the old broken-down hack. The hack is so like her, I'm ready to swear, the bailiff will think he has Mulligan's mare. So out with the racer and in with the screw. We'll show him what Mulligan's talent can do. And if he gets nasty and dares to say much, I'll knock him as stiff as my grandmother's crutch." Then off to the town went the mare and the lad. The bailiff came out, never dreamt he was had, but marched to the stall with a confident air. "I levy," said he, "upon Mulligan's mare." He watched her by day, and he watched her by night. She was never an instant let out of his sight. For races were coming away in the west, and Mulligan's mare had a chance with the best. "Here's a chance," thought the bailiff, "to serve my own ends. I'll send off a wire to my bookmaking friends. Get all you can borrow, beg, snavel, or snare, and lay the whole lot against Mulligan's mare. The races came round, and a crowd on the course were laying the mare till they made themselves hoarse, and Mulligan's party, with ardour intense, they backed her for pounds and for shillings and pence. And think of the grief of the book-making host at the sound of the summons to go to the post, for down to the start, with her thoroughbred air, as fit as a fiddle pranced Mulligan's mare. They started, and off went the boy to the front. He cleared out at once, and he made it a hunt. He steadied as rounding the corner they wheeled, then gave her her head, and she smothered the field. The race put her owner right clear of his debts. He landed a fortune in stakes and in bets. He paid the old bailiff the whole of his pelf, and gave him a hiding to keep for himself. So all you bold sportsmen, take warning, I pray. Keep clear of the running, you will find it don't pay. For the very best rule that you'll hear in a week is never to bet on a thing that can speak. And whether you're lucky or whether you lose, keep clear of the cards and keep clear of the booze. And fortune in season will answer your prayer and send you a flyer like Mulligan's mare. End of Mulligan's Mare by Banjo Paterson. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Algy Pug.
Chapter 4 of Gaudenzia, Pride at the Palio, by Marguerite Henry. Coffee Break Collection 38. Horses. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Newborn. A newborn. The daughter of Sans Souci was already foaled when the farmer and the horse doctor arrived in Magliano Toscano. She had already dropped on the bed of straw, and there she lay, flat and wet, like a rug left out in the rain. Her eyes were closed, and her nostrils not even fluttering. The doctor, a sharp-eyed, determined little man, hastily pulled out his stethoscope, and falling to his knees in the straw, held it to the foal's side, listening. The farmer stood on, pale and helpless, no less a person than Sans Souci's owner, the Prince of Lombardy, wanted to buy the foal, but only if it were sound and sturdy. He had even agreed to pay the horse doctor's fee. Would he, if she died? She must not die. The heart? The farmer whispered anxiously. It beats? No? Only faint, the doctor replied, like butterfly wings. Straightening up, he snapped out his orders. You got to help. Lift her up. No, not like that. By her hind legs. Hang her upside down. The blood, it's got to flow to the brain. Frightened into submission, the farmer did as he was told, while the doctor began furiously rubbing the foal's sides. The perfect little head was thrust back, mouth agape. The doctor stopped a moment, placed his hands against her chest, but there were still no signs of breathing. He pulled an old towel from his satchel, doused it in the watering trough, and slapped the colt. "Wake up," he cried. "Get courage, little one. Breathe. Ahead lies the world." Still no response. The gray lump hung from the farmer's hand like a carcass in a butcher shop. "What we do now?" the farmer asked. "Lay her down," the doctor shouted, unwilling to give up. "Fetch the wheelbarrow." Puzzled, the farmer hurried out to the lean-to beside the barn. The doctor crouched on his knees and, with slow, forceful motions, pressed the tiny squeeze-box of the colt's ribs. "Breathe! Breathe! Breathe!" he panted as he tried to pump air into her lungs. The mare all this while had been lying exhausted. She lifted her head now and let out a cry that was half squeal, half whinny. As if in answer, there was a gasp from her foal, then a shallow cough, followed by a whimper. When the farmer came rattling in with a wheelbarrow, he stopped in awe. "She does not go under," he exclaimed. Then he laughed in relief. "The wheelbarrow, you don't need it now." "Now I do." Cheeks flushed in triumph, the doctor kept on pumping air into the filly's lungs, and at the same time barking out directions. "Be quick. Fill a gunny sack with straw. Lay it flat on the wheelbarrow. The gasps were coming closer together. They were stronger and stronger. The doctor stopped pumping. He listened through his stethoscope and heaved a deep sigh. "Is greatest thing I ever see. The mare, she helped me just in time." Proudly he lifted the newborn on top of the stuffed gunny sack. "We take her now into your kitchen and dry her by your fire." "But why?" the farmer asked, more puzzled than before. "Why, when already she breathes?" "Please to remember this, my friend. For 11 months she is living in a very warm place. Today is windy, and it blows cool into the barn." Nodding, the farmer trundled the little creature past the stalls of cows and bullocks and through the door that led into the kitchen. "Maria," he called to his wife, as he lifted the foal from the wheelbarrow and placed her beside the fire. "See what it is we bring." The farmer's wife, a plump, pleasant woman with eyes as shiny as olives, came running from another room. Politely she greeted the doctor, set out a bottle of her best wine and a glass on the table for him. Then in an instant she was on her knees cooing, "Ah, poor little one! Poor little dear!" Without thinking, she had taken off her homespun apron and was rubbing the filly as if its ribs were a washboard. "Brava, brava!" cried the doctor between sips of the golden wine. "Your wife," he remarked to the farmer, "is a nurse most competent. Guard well you do not burn the little one so close to the fire. Rub the legs and body until nice and dry. Then take her back to her dam." He knelt down and put a finger in the filly's mouth. "See, already she sucks. By herself she will find the mare's milk faucets. And now I must leave. Arrivederci, my good people." The doctor's happy laughter rang out behind him as he walked across the dooryard to the hitching post. In the warm kitchen a second miracle was taking place. The foal, yawning, looking about with her purple-brown eyes, was stretching her forelegs, learning so soon that legs were for standing. The farmer slowly shook his head as if now he saw her for the first time, her frailty, her pipe-stem legs. "Already I have a name for her," he said dully. "So, how will you call her?" "Farfalla, butterfly." "Is so beautiful," Maria sighed. "Beauty, bah, is not enough." The farmer's eyes was a look almost of hatred. A stout horse the Prince of Lombardy wanted, nice strong legs to race over the cobbled streets of Siena. With a colt by Sanssouci he hoped to win a Palio. Better that horse doctor never came. With a flirt of her tail the foal tried a step, and fell down in a fuzzy heap. The farmer winced, almost as if he heard a leg snap and break. "Spindle legs have no place in Palio," he snorted. "And for sure I cannot use such a skinny beast in farm work. Better the hand of death had taken her. Farfalla," he laughed bitterly. "She will live only the short and useless life of the butterfly." The Prince of Lombardy did not come to see the colt for several days. He was a busy man, a knot collector and a sportsman who raced his horses, not only in Italy but in France and Spain. His burning desire, however, was to win a Palio. This, he knew, required a special kind of horse, one not too finely wrought. He knew, too, that the marshy land of the Maremma made an excellent breeding ground, developing horses with strong, heavy bone, and so he let the farmers of the Maremma bring their mares to his Arabian stallion to be bred. Then, if the mating brought forth a strong, rugged colt, he would agree to buy it at weaning time. When he finally arrived at Magliano Toscano, late one afternoon, the farmer broke into a nervous sweat. Maybe, he thought to himself, the prince will buy the little one, not for the Palio, but for racing on dirt tracks. The mare and colt were out in a field at the time, wallowing in a sea of grass. The farmer whistled them in, and as they approached he turned to the prince. "Here comes Farfalla." He trumpeted the words as if they could make the filly as big as the shout. "She will lighten in color, signore, and become pure white, like Sanssouci, no?" A quizzical expression crossed the prince's face. He watched the foal dance and curvet in front of him. His eyes went over her, inch by inch, studying her legs, her hindquarters. After a seeming eternity, he repeated her name. "Farfalla," he mused. "The name suits her well. She appears capricious, nervous, not what I had hoped. She is none of the bulk and brawn of the dam, but nevertheless I will pay the cost to the veterinarian, and it is my hope you will find some use for her." Waving his gauntlets and good-bye, he stepped into his open-top car and roared off into the twilight. End of The Newborn by Marguerite Henry.
Ode to the Horse by Mrs. S. E. Currier. Coffee Break Collection 38. Horses. Ode to the Horse. Who does not love a noble horse, so trusty and so kind, who serves his master part in fear, and love and faith combined? He is not only man's best friend, but man's best servant too. Whether treated good or treated ill, he is faithful, kind, and true. He plows the ground and plants the grain, he reaps and rakes and mows, and draws the heavy harvest wain from morn till evening's close. He treads the course with lightning speed, though often much abused, and strains each nerve with powerful will, that man may be amused. Then let the hand that guides the rein be ever kind and true, for the horse is God's creation, just as much as I or you. End of Ode to the Horse by Mrs. S. E. Currier. Recording by Elsie Selwyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
On Horseback by E. Paxton Hood. Coffee Break Collection 38. Horses. On Horseback. Hurrah! For a ride in the morning grey, on the back of a bounding steed. What pleasure to list how the wild winds play! Hark! Hark! To their music, away! Away! Gallop away with speed. 'Neath the leaf and the cloud in springtime's pride, there is health in a morning's joyous ride. And hurrah for a ride in the sultry noon, when the summer has mounted high, 'neath the shady wood in the glowing June, when the rivulet chanteth its lullaby tune to the breeze as it wanders by, quietly down by the brooklet's side. Sweet is the summer's joyous ride. And do you not love at evening's hour, by the light of the sinking sun, to wend your way o'er the widening moor, where the silvery mists their mystery pour, while the stars come one by one, over the heath by the mountain's side? Pensive and sweet is the evening's ride. I tell thee, O stranger, that unto me the plunge of a fiery steed is a noble thought. To the brave and free, it is music and breath and majesty. 'Tis the life of a noble deed, and the heart and the mind are in spirit allied in the charm of a morning's glorious ride. Then hurrah for the ring of the bridle rein! Away, brave horse, away! The preacher or poet may chant their strain, the bookman his wine of the past may drain. We bide not with them today, and yet it is true we may look with pride on the mental spoils of a morning's ride. End of On Horseback by E. Paxton Hood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
Making Policemen of Horses by Edwin Emerson. Coffee Break Collection 38. Horses. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ted Lienhart. CenturyPast.org. Making Policemen of Horses. To watch for 5 minutes at some one of the congested points of New York's thoroughfares, where several streets intersect and mounted policemen, posted amid whirlpools of traffic, unravel the tangled snarl of crowding teams, automobiles, pedestrians, all at cross purposes, brings home to the spectator with forcible effect The realization that it is the horse which is in the main responsible for the safeguarding of the city streets, and that a stupid or ill-trained animal would bring about disaster. In fact, fully the greater part of the work falls on the horse. The man upon its back only thinks and points and talks, while the horse carries him to the strategic point, or swinging about, or sidling, or backing, throws its body into the breach without ever a quaver at the ever imminent danger to itself. Watch a police force handling a crowd, and you cannot but admire the intelligent discrimination with which the horse, while apparently threatening to trample everybody underfoot, never really hurts anyone. On New Year's Eve in New York, according to newspaper estimates, nearly 1 million people thronged up and down Broadway and Wall Street to hear the midnight chimes ring out from Trinity Steeple, or rather to drown the music of those chimes with a blatant blare of innumerable tin horns. 6 weeks before that, on election night, when Mr. Taft came into his own, it was reported that over 1 million people crowded about the bulletin boards and canvas sheets exhibited along Newspaper Row and up and down Broadway. During both of these outpourings of the giant city's multitude, there were no casualties or accidents of moment. The credit for this, very properly, was claimed by the police of New York, and particularly by the 1,000-odd men of the Metropolitan Traffic Squad. No one had a good word to say for the horses. On the contrary, many of those who had to give way before their hoofs cursed them roundly. Yet, if credit were given where it rightly belonged for the work of those 2 nights, the horses should at least receive an honorable mention. There is in New York a horse belonging to a mounted policeman stationed on Wall Street, whose business it is to keep the narrow roadway of that crowded street as clear as possible from pedestrians. At the lunch hour, many of the messenger boys employed by the brokers of the so-called curb market, who transact their business in the open, make it their habit to squat down on the curb as they eat their luncheon. Ordinarily, this is a practice not to be tolerated by any intelligent police horse, but during the noon hour, this horse is willing to make exception. Therefore, when by chance its rider drives it along the curb at that hour, the horse, with a knowing wink to the boys, carefully steps over every one of their outstretched legs. The boys know just what to expect and never stir. Incidentally, this forbearance on the part of the horse is apt to result in banana peels or apple cores handed up from the sidewalk. This is an unusual trick, of course, yet any one of the 800 horses now doing duty in the mounted police squad of New York could be taught to do the same thing. The reason for this is that all the horses in the traffic squad have been selected with a special eye to intelligence and good horse sense, and furthermore, they have all been put through a special course of horsemanship. The man who is responsible for all this is Mr. T.H. Shanton, who bears the official title of Foreman of Horse and Horse Equipments in the New York Police Department, but is best known among horsemen as Buffalo Bill's Laramie Kid. He it is who, with the aid of a deputy commissioner and a veterinary surgeon, purchases every horse that goes into the mounted police force of Greater New York, and who is responsible for its proper training and general welfare, both before and after its final entry into the police service. In addition to this, it devolves upon Mr. Shanton to purchase all horse supplies, such as fodder, blankets, saddles, bridles, halters, shoes, spurs, soap, curry combs, and brushes, as well as horse medicine. Besides this, he must maintain general supervision over all police stables and over the police riding school and horse training farm at Jamaica on Long Island. As might be inferred, Mr. Shanton is a very busy man, and his inspection automobile is kept so constantly in service that it is a hard thing ever to catch him at leisure. To see Mr. Shanton at his best, one should watch him either while he is selecting a horse for purchase or when he takes a hand in training some specially difficult steed out at the horse farm. In the purchase of police horses, certain rules prevail. These rules are mostly of Mr. Shanton's own making. For instance, no mares or stallions are ever chosen. All must be geldings, and all must be of uniform height, weight, and color. That is, no horse under 15½ hands and under 900 pounds is eligible for police service. The ideal police horse should stand 16 hands high and weigh 1,000 pounds. In color, it should be bay or chestnut, preferably with a black mane and tail and without marks. Docked tails or brandings are considered undesirable mutilations. Of course, every horse selected for purchase must be sound in wind and limb, and preferably young, that is, not older than 6 years. The average price paid for such horses is $310 apiece. The price is fixed by the police commissioners in the form of open bids. Generally, the animals are supplied by some large horse mart. They are selected by a purchasing board of 3 and are taken on 30 days probation. The probation period of 30 days covers the training period, after which time the newly chosen horses must be either returned to the horse mart as unacceptable or turned into the traffic squad or mounted park police as horses fit and ready for police duty. Fit for police duty means that the horse must be broken to the saddle and to go in single and double harness in case of emergency service. All that is required of a first-class saddle horse is required of a police horse. This means that a horse must be well bitted, must be bridle-wise and leg-wise. In other words, it must respond at once to any tug on the bit, to pressure from the reins or from the rider's legs. It must be ready at call to walk, stop, sidle, back, trot, canter, gallop, or run, and must know how to traverse or change its lead while galloping. Then it must know how to stand alone without its rider, and how to handle crowds by pushing or backing into them without harming them. Furthermore, it must know how to catch up with runaway horses. All these things can be taught only through incessant practice and by the exercise of constant patience and perseverance. On the police horse training farm, these are the only methods in vogue. There, under the supervision of Mr. Shanton, are 5 horse trainers who, together with as many hostlers, attend to nothing else but the education of new police horses. Like their chief, these trainers are picked horsemen who have earned their reputation as first-class riders by long experience in the saddle as cavalrymen, mounted policemen, or jockeys. When they have trained a horse and pronounced him fit to be ridden, that horse may be depended on as a perfect saddle horse. Most of their lessons are taught by kindness and unremitting patience, coupled with firmness, followed by sure rewards such as sugar, petting, or luscious carrots. Great pains are taken by them in the matter of properly bitting a horse, for on that depend such necessary acts as stopping and backing. A horse that has not been properly trained to the bit when the reins are drawn taut, instead of arching its neck or backing as it should, will rear and sometimes topple over. This is not so much because its mouth is tender as because the muscles of its neck have not been rendered sufficiently supple by constant practice to enable it to arch its neck. To make things easier for both rider and mount, the New York policemen, unlike the cavalry, use double bits, a linked snaffle bit for light reining and a curb bit with chin chain for sudden stops or backing. Once a horse has been taught to bear a saddle and afterward a rider, and to respond to the bit, he is made bridle-wise and leg-wise by riding him around and around over a course laid out in a figure 8, so as to get him used to sudden swerving from right to left, and vice versa. Jumping over ditches and hurdles, first riderless and then with different riders, comes after this. The final lessons, toward the close of the month, consist in chasing runaway horses. For this purpose, the police training farm keeps a special trick horse, a little gray mare named Miss Duffy, who knows just how to run away with an empty cart clattering behind her, and also knows how to let herself be overtaken and brought to a halt. After a green horse has gone through this performance about a dozen times, he knows just what is expected of him, and ever after will prick up his ears at the sound of galloping hoofs, ready at his rider's call to start instantly in full pursuit. By the time a horse has learned all these things, his trainers have also had abundant opportunity to learn whether he is a good horse or not, and whether he will do for the job. If not, back he goes to the horse market. The dealer does not get his money, but instead of that, he gets a very well-trained saddle horse in place of a raw, unbroken colt. In fact, it is safe to say that the horse bought for $310 by Mr. Shanton, by the time he turns in for service in the mounted squad, is worth just about twice as much. Thus, stated in terms of profit and loss, we get a much better idea just what Mr. Shanton's work is worth to the city of New York in money. But it is worth much more than that, for Mr. Shanton has provided the city of New York with the best mounted police force in the world. End of Making Policemen of Horses by Edwin Emerson.
Sally by Mary Boyle. Coffee Break Collection 38. Horses. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Winnifred Assmann. Sally. If you take a short-horned cow, a limping calf, a few sheep, a swarm of fowls, a pig with a litter of 8, and an everyday lazy kind of horse, you have John Dobbin's well-stocked farm. One morning John woke up at 5, bustled round the hen coop, gave an extra feed to the pigs, milked the cow, fed the limping calf, and then went into the stables. "Now, Sally, old girl," he said, making some fuss as he fed his old mare, "just keep your eye on things a bit. I'm going round to Farmer Peckett. He's in bed, bad with rheumatism, and I shan't be back afore dinner." So saying, he took the halter from Sally's neck and let her roam about at will. Sally, left to herself, felt glumpy. "Now, where's the master gone off this morning?" thought she. "Farmer Peckett. I know no Farmer Peckett. It's very queer his leaving us all alone. Something might go wrong while he's away, and he can see to things a lot better than me. Just look, there's that calf a-limping among the lettuces, and that knock-kneed hen with her chirrupy brood scratching the carrots up as if she was seeking tomorrow. I do believe those bees mean to swarm, and no master here. I've watched him swarm 'em many a time, but I couldn't manage it. If you're not off about your business, you old gimmer," as a long-nosed sheep looked through the hedge, I'll... Now what do you want?" called out Sally, turning from the patient ewe to a fat, wheezy donkey coming up the garden path. "What brings you here this morning, Neddy?" "Hee-haw," said Neddy, rolling his tongue round and round, and giving a 3-cornered look out of his left eye. "Thought I'd just see how you were getting on, Sal. But you do look prime. Just be off about your business." "Beg your pardon, my lady, but if you have no objections, I'll just march myself off into the stable. I know Farmer Dobbin supplies you with good fodder." And away went Neddy, hee-hawing for all he was worth, and frightening the chicks out of their poor little senses. While Sally was looking after him and marvelling at his cool impertinence, up came a tinker. "Pans to mend, kettles to mend, scraps of old iron," he cried. "What, Sally?" he called out cheerfully to her. "Hee-haw!" bellowed Neddy. "Where's John Dobbin? Are you carrying on the farm by yourself, Sally? Well, you're a fine steed to place in front of any man's castle. I'll speak a word for you when I see the general again. He's sure to be wanting a new charger to carry him off to the wars soon. But I see you're figgity, Sally, so I'll bid you good day. Pans to mend, kettles to mend, scraps of old iron." "Mercy on us!" wailed the frightened creature, the perspiration dropping from her nose end. "How thankful I am to think he's gone! If he'd walked into the kitchen, and master out, he'd have smoked up all his new baccy. When will it be 12 o'clock? Oh, but I don't like looking after things. I will be glad when master comes home." Because she felt relieved of anxiety, a warm feeling spread all over Sally, and her poor old heart felt happy. Even Nettie's ugly hee-hawing failed to rouse her ire, so she fell to trotting about the garden in a silly kind of way. While Sally was frisking about in a happy-go-lucky fashion, up came a sailor. "Morning," he said. "Fine time of year, this." Sally looked sad. "No one at home, eh? Where's John Dobbin? Hasn't left any message, eh? Stand out of the way, and I'll go into the house and sit down till John comes. Bravo, my beauty," stroking the limping calf. "You're a fine mixed lot of customers, I can see. Master John will be at the market, I'll be bound. It's 20 years since John and me met. Won't we have a fine time of it now? I hear he's never married, no more have I. Wait till he comes in, we'll be spinning yarns till bedtime." All this time Sally was pawing at the cobbles with her hoof. "Well, you're a cool hand, to be sure," thought she. "And he's helping himself to my master's baccy. Well, if that doesn't beat all. I've got him in the kitchen at any rate, and if he isn't quite quiet, he looks honest. I'd best be off and see how Nettie's getting on, for he's a first-class scamp, if you like." And away she trotted, seeing on the road that the bees were hard at work, for you will understand how this lazy old horse was most particular that everyone else but herself should be working. She did not like to see anything idle. If you notice, animals that have lived a long time with people learn to know their ways. And it may sound funny to you children, but I have often seen animals try and imitate their owners. So if any of you have a pet, you must be careful and behave kindly before it, for then at least you will be setting a good example. And I would advise you to have nothing to do with a boy whose dog fears him, or with a girl who is not kind to her dollies. "Now, where is Nettie?" said the weary mare, "for not a speck of him can I find. There's every bit of fodder munched up, rakes and spades kicked about. Yes, he's been here, sure enough. And there's the brand-new bucket stamped on. Whatever will master say? This is keeping an eye on things till master comes back, isn't it? Oh, dear me, I've got a runagate donkey somewhere, and a jack tar in the kitchen smoking my master's baccy. Bow, wow, wow. What's the matter now?" As Sally turned round, she saw a sheep-dog. "Oh, Ben, it's you!" she cried. "I'm nearly worried out of my wits. For goodness' sake, do stop here, Ben, and keep guard till master comes back. There's the bow-legged, top-end hen wants keeping in her place, and that limping calf ought to be tethered. And Nettie ought to be sent home instead of stamping the fodder about and kicking the new bucket, and there's that sailor chap in the kitchen smoking my master's baccy. Mercy on us, what's that?" as a band struck up a gay tune. "It's a travelling circus! No, it isn't. My word, the whole village is up, and our sailor gentleman is dancing a hornpipe. Thank goodness, there's master coming. Whoever would have thought of things happening like this?" "What cheer, John?" cried the sailor, extending his hand and running forward to meet his old friend. "How are you, my hearty? What, don't you know me, John? My old chum. Why, I'm Sam, surely." "It can't be, but it is," and the farmer's voice became husky. "I've thought you dead this many a year. So you've actually returned, Sammy? To settle in the old country and to pitch my tent alongside of yours, John." "Look here, you sailor man," cried Sally. "Master belongs to me. We run this farm between us, we do, and we want no hornpipey sailor to join us." "And where does this band come from?" asked the farmer. The musicians, let me say, were trumpeting and drumming for all they were worth. "Well, I brought it with me from Yarmouth. Look here, my hearties," he called out. "Change the tune to Old Lang Syne, and we will all join in the chorus." which everybody did. Even Neddy sat on his haunches and hee-hawed his loudest, of course, lolling his tongue round as usual and throwing three-cornered glances in all directions. The limping calf was touched and was suddenly seized with a racing fit, and the chickens, no doubt thinking that the end of the world had come, turned somersaults and fought battles in all directions. Poor Sally groaned aloud. "Ah, this is the end of everything," she said. "I've cared for and worked for master for many a year, and now what between the sailor, the band, the chickens, the bees, and Neddy? Well—" "I think the whole stock has taken leave of their senses," said Farmer John. "Why, Sally, lass," he said, looking upon his woebegone horse and patting her on the shoulder, "do you think, old girl, that I have forgotten thee? No, no. Now, my good people," flinging a coin to the musicians, "I thank you for your music, and good day to you. Don't you see that you are frightening my animals? Neighbors," he cried, addressing the crowd, "good day to you also. And Sam, my man, quick march into the house. Adieu," he cried to the departing crowd. "This sort of thing don't quite suit country folk. Now do it, Sally." And as he led the horse by the halter, he whispered in her ear, "Now you needn't go and be jealous, old girl. Sam shan't put your nose out. You've been a good old servant to me, and you're missus here, so keep your temper." Sally stamped her feet. "He says he's come to retire with you, master," she began, only John had walked away. "And oh," whinnied Sally, only John did not hear her, "after I've been missus ever so long, it's hard to be supplanted by a hornpipey sailor." End of Sally by Mary Boyle.
The Silver Horseshoes by Abby Phillips Walker. Coffee Break Collection 38. Horses. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Merritt. Once upon a time, there lived a king who wanted a son-in-law who would be a good soldier as well as a good husband. So he put his daughter, the princess, who of course was very beautiful, in a tower on top of a high mountain. Then he sent out word all over the kingdom, and to all the other kingdoms, that to the youth who could get to the top of the tower, he would give the princess for a wife. But when the youths came from far and near, they found the mountain was slippery as glass, and their horses slipped back faster than they could climb. In a kingdom far from where the king lived was a poor prince whose father had lost all his lands and money in wars, so that when he died he left the prince nothing but the castle and a black horse. One day the prince was feeding his horse and thinking of the princess on top of the high mountain in the tower, and he spoke his thought out loud. "If only I had some clothes fit to be seen," he said, "I would try to reach the princess in the tower, and this poverty would be at an end. And you, my beauty, would have oats in plenty," patting the horse on the neck. "Why don't you try, master?" said the horse. The prince was surprised to hear the horse speak, but still he had heard of such things happening, and he answered, saying, "I have no clothes. Besides, many others have tried, and no horse is able to climb the mountain. Master, go to the witch that lives in a cave in the middle of the woods at midnight, and get my shoes," said the horse. And then he fell to eating his scanty dinner, and said no more. The prince thought there was nothing to lose by doing as the horse told him, so that night he went to the woods to find the witch. The woods he found easily, but to find the cave was a different matter. First he met a fox, and he asked the way to the cave of the witch. "Oh, master," said the fox, "take my advice and go home. No good will come to you if you find it." But the prince would not give up the quest, so he asked a wolf that he met next where the cave was located in the woods. The wolf ran away, saying, "You better go home. That cave will bring only harm to anyone who finds it." The prince was not to be frightened, and on he went, and an owl was the next one he saw. "Where is the cave the old witch lives in?" he asked. "Hoot, hoot," said the owl, flapping its wings. "Be off, man, while there is time. Don't go near that cave if you value your life." And off flew the owl, leaving the prince no wiser than before. After going deep in the woods, in fact, he was at the very center and did not know it, the prince stood still and listened. A sound reached his ear that seemed like the clatter of horses' hoofs, and the prince went in the direction from which the sound came. All of a sudden, he found himself in front of the cave for which he had searched so long, and looking in, he saw the old witch prancing about in the craziest manner. She would climb the side of her cave with as much ease as she could walk across the floor, and then, giving a spring, she would walk on the top of the cave, her head hanging down toward the floor. While the prince was looking and wondering at this strange performance, he noticed something shining on her feet, and when he looked closer, to his surprise, he saw that the witch had on her feet silver horseshoes. Then he knew that his black horse had said what was worth listening to. He was to get the shoes the old witch was wearing. But then he thought, "She has on only 2. I must have 4. I wonder where are the other 2? Just then a black cat came dancing into the cave, and on her hind feet the prince saw the other 2 shoes he wanted. Such dancing and climbing the prince had never seen, as was done by the old witch and her black cat. The silver shoes seemed to take them anywhere, and they could do anything while they wore them. After a while, the witch and the black cat grew weary and took off the shoes, and the prince saw them lift up a stone in the middle of the cave and drop the 4 silver horseshoes into a hole, and then drop the stone again. After the witch and the black cat were fast asleep in one corner of the cave, the prince crept in softly and lifted the stone. At the bottom of a deep hole he saw the horseshoes, and he was wondering how he could get them when he felt a push from behind, and down he went into the hole, landing at the bottom where the shoes were. The old witch had wakened and had pushed him in, and the prince could hear her and the cat jumping about and laughing with glee that they had trapped him. When the prince found himself in the hole under the cave where the old witch lived, he thought his end had come. It was as dark as a dungeon. The only thing he could see was the glitter of the silver horseshoes. While he stood looking at them and thinking how the old witch and her cat jumped about, and wondering what she would do with him, he suddenly was struck with an idea. He would put on the shoes, 1 on each foot, and take the other 2 in his hands. No sooner did he think it than he did it, and giving a spring, up he went, the stone flying off the top of the hole, as he touched it with his hands holding the silver horseshoes. Into the cave he jumped, and the old witch and her black cat sprang at him. But he had only to run, and without touching the ground, away he flew through the forest, the old witch and her cat after him. Sometimes they would almost catch him, for the witch had jumped on her broomstick, and the cat sat on behind her, and they flew over trees and bushes as well as the prince. The prince knew he was lost if they caught him, and finally decided to turn around and run toward them, thinking he might be able to knock the witch off her broomstick, and so stop their flight. No sooner did he turn than the shining silver shoes cast a ray of light on the old witch and her cat, and like magic they tumbled off the broomstick, and away went the stick higher and higher in the air until it disappeared. And on the ground where the cat and the old witch fell, the prince saw 2 stones, one big and the other smaller and almost black. So he knew he was rid of his enemies and could get out of the forest safely with the silver horseshoes. The black horse danced with delight when he saw the shoes, and stood still until they were fastened on his feet. Then he pranced about and shook his head in a very knowing manner, though he did not speak again. And the prince mounted him and rode away, forgetting all about his shabby coat. The black horse trotted along like any other horse until they came to the mountain on top of which the princess lived in the tower. Then the prince felt himself gliding up the mountain past all the other youths, who were vainly trying to climb to the top. Up and up they went until the prince found himself by the tower. When he looked at the height, he knew his troubles were not at an end. He looked around for some way to scale the wall, but it was as smooth as glass. While he stood looking at the top, he saw something white slowly coming down the wall from a little window. Down it came until the prince could see that it was a piece of white thread, and on the end of it was a little golden curl. The prince untied it and kissed it. Then, looking up at the window, he kissed his hand, for he knew that somewhere in the tower the princess had been looking for the prince who was to come for her, and had seen him. He was more anxious than ever to reach the princess, but how could he climb those slippery walls? How? And then he thought of the silver shoes that the witch had walked on the top of the cave with, and he took them off his horse and tied one on each foot and took one in each hand. Placing his hands on the wall of the tower, he walked up as easily as if he were walking on the ground, and in a few minutes was at the little window above. The princess smiled when she saw him, and then he saw that the window, which looked so small to him from the ground, was really a door. He stepped in and knelt at the feet of the blushing princess, who said, "I shall be glad to leave here, but how can I get to the ground?" "In my arms," answered the bold prince, and picking her up, he stepped out on the smooth wall again, easily reaching the ground with the princess. He placed her in front of him on his horse and rode down the mountain, at the bottom of which a crowd was waiting for him, and the king also, for it had been noised abroad that a youth had been seen to climb the mountain, and the people wanted to see him. "Well done, my son," said the king, riding up to greet him. "You will make a good soldier, for you have shown that you can overcome obstacles to gain that which you desire. Come home, the wedding feast is prepared." So the prince gained a princess for a wife, a father-in-law who admired his courage, and was happy ever after. End of Silver Horseshoes by Abby Phillips Walker.
Taming the Wild Horse by W.G. Sims. Coffee Break Collection 38. Horses. Taming the Wild Horse. Last night he trampled with 1,000 steeds the trembling desert. Now he stands alone. His speed hath baffled theirs. His fellows lurk behind on heavy sands with weary limbs that cannot reach him. From the highest hill he gazes o'er the wild whose plains he's spurned, and his eye kindles and his breast expands with an upheaving consciousness of might. He stands an instant, then he breaks away, as revelling in his freedom. What if art that strikes soul into marble could but seize that agony of action, could impress its muscular fullness with its winged haste upon the resisting rock while wonder stares and admiration worships? There, away, as glorying in that mighty wilderness and conscious of the gazing skies o'erhead, quiver for flight his sleek and slender limbs, elastic, springing into headlong force, while his smooth neck, curved loftily to arch, dignifies flight and to his speed imparts the majesty not else its attribute. And circling now he sweeps the flowery plain, as if 'twere his, imperious, gathering up his limbs unwearied by their sportive play, until he stands, an idol of the sight. He stands and trembles. The warm life is gone that gave him action. Wherefore is it thus? His eye hath lost its lustre. though it still sends forth a glance of consciousness and care, to a deep agony of acuteness wrought, and straining at a point, a narrow point, that rises but a speck upon the verge of the horizon. Sure, the humblest life hath in God's providence some gracious guides that warn it of its foe. The danger there his instinct teaches, and with growing dread, no more solicitous of graceful flight, he bounds across the plain, he speeds away into the tameless wilderness afar, to 'scape his bondage. Yet in vain his flight, vain his fleet limbs, his desperate aim, his leap through the close thicket, through the festering swamp and rushing waters. His proud neck must bend beneath a halter, and the iron parts and tears his delicate mouth. The brave steed, late bounding in his freedom's consciousness, the leader of the wild, unreached of all, wears gaudy trappings and becomes a slave. He bears a master on his shrinking back, he feels a rowel in his bleeding flanks, and his arched neck, beneath the biting thong, burns while he bounds away, all desperate, across the desert, mad with the vain hope to shake his burden off. He writhes, he turns on his oppressor, he would rend the foe, who subtle with less strength had taken him thus, at foul advantage, but he strives in vain. A sudden pang, a newer form of pain, baffles and bears him on. He feels his fate, and with a shriek of agony which tells, loudly, the terrors of his new estate, he makes the desert, his own desert, ring with the wild clamors of his new-born grief. One fruitless effort more, one desperate bound, for the old freedom of his natural life, and then he humbles to his cruel lot, submits, and finds his conqueror in man. End of Taming the Wild Horse by W.G. Sims. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
The Doctor's Horse by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. Coffee Break Collection 38. Horses. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Beeswaxcandle. The Doctor's Horse. The horse was a colt when he was purchased with the money paid by the heirs of one of the doctor's patients, and those were his days of fire. At first it was opined that the horse would never do for the doctor. He was too nervous, and his nerves beyond the reach of the doctor's drugs. He shied at every wayside bush and stone. He ran away several times. He was loath to stand, and many a time the doctor in those days was forced to rush from the bedsides of patients to seize his refractory horse by the bridle and soothe and compel him to quiet. The horse in that untamed youth of his was like a furnace of fierce animal fire. When he was given rein on a frosty morning, the pound of his iron-bound hoofs on the rigid roads cleared them of the slow, plodding country teams. A current, as of the very freedom and invincibility of life, seemed to pass through the taut reins to the doctor's hands. But the doctor was the master of his horse, as of all other things with which he came in contact. He was a firm and hard man in the pursuance of his duty, never yielding to it with love, but unswervingly stanch. He was never cruel to his horse. He seldom whipped him, but he never petted him. He simply mastered him, and after a while the fiery animal began to go the doctor's gait, and not his own. When the doctor was sent for in a hurry to an emergency case, the horse stretched his legs at a gallop, no matter how little inclined he felt for it, perhaps on a burning day of summer. When there was no haste, and the doctor disposed to take his time, the horse went at a gentle amble, even though the frosts of a winter morning were firing his blood, and every one of his iron nerves and muscles was strained with that awful strain of repressed motion. Even on those mornings, the horse would stand at the door of the patient who was ill with old-fashioned consumption or chronic liver disease, his forelegs planted widely, his head and neck describing a long downward curve, so expressive of submission and dejection, that it might have served as a hieroglyphic for them, and no more thought of letting those bounding impulses of his have their way than if the doctor's will had verily bound his every foot to the ground with unbreakable chains of servitude. He had become the doctor's horse. He was the will of the doctor, embodied in a perfect compliance of action and motion. People remarked how the horse had sobered down. What a splendid animal he was for the doctor, and they had thought that he would never be able to keep him and employ him in his profession. Now and then the horse used to look around at the empty buggy as he stood at the gate of a patient's house, to see if the doctor were there, but the will which held the reins, being still evident to his consciousness, even when its owner was absent, kept him in his place. He would have no thought of taking advantage of his freedom. He would turn his head and droop it in that curve of utter submission, shift his weight slightly to another foot, make a sound which was like a human sigh of patience, and wait again. When the doctor, carrying his little medicine chest, came forth, he would sometimes look at him, sometimes not, but he would set every muscle into an attitude of readiness for progress at the feel of the taut lines and the sound of the masterly human voice behind him. Then he would proceed to the house of the next patient, and the story would be repeated. The horse seemed to live his life in a perfect monotony of identical chapters. His waiting was scarcely cheered or stimulated by the vision and anticipation of his stall and his supper, so unvarying was it. The same stall, the same measure of oats, the same allotment of hay. He was never put out to pasture, for the doctor was a poor man, and unable to buy another horse and to spare him. All the variation which came to his experience was the uncertainty as to the night calls. Sometimes he would feel a slight revival of spirit and rebellion when led forth on a bitter winter night from his stolidity of repose, broken only by the shifting of his weight for bodily comfort, never by any perturbation of his inner life. The horse had no disturbing memories, and no anticipations, but he was still somewhat sensitive to surprises. When the flare of the lantern came athwart his stall, and he felt the doctor's hand at his halter in the deep silence of a midnight, he would sometimes feel himself as a separate consciousness from the doctor, and experience the individualizing of contrary desires. Now and then he pulled back, planting his 4 feet firmly, but he always yielded in a second before the masterly will of the man. Sometimes he started with a vicious emphasis, but it was never more than momentary. In the end, he fell back into his state of utter submission. The horse was not unhappy. He was well cared for. His work, though considerable, was not beyond his strength. He had lost something undoubtedly in this complete surrender of his own will, but a loss of which one is unconscious tends only to the degradation of an animal, not to his misery. The doctor often remarked with pride that his horse was a well-broken animal, somewhat stupid but faithful. All the timid women folk in the village looked upon him with favour. The doctor's wife, who was nervous, loved to drive with her husband behind this docile horse, and was not afraid even to sit while the doctor was visiting his patients, with the reins over the animal's back. The horse had become to her a piece of mechanism absolutely under the control of her husband, and he was, in truth, little more. Still, a furnace is a furnace, even when the fire runs low, and there is always the possibility of a blaze. The doctor had owned the horse several years, though he was still young, when a young woman came to live in the family. She was the doctor's niece, a fragile thing, so exposed as to her network of supersensitive nerves to all the winds of life that she was always in a quiver of reciprocation or repulsion. She feared everything unknown and all strength. She was innately suspicious of the latter. She knew its power to work her harm and believed in its desire to do so. Especially was she afraid of that rampant and uncertain strength of a horse. Never did she ride behind one, but she watched his every motion. She herself shied in spirit at every wayside stone. She watched for him to do his worst. She had no faith when she was told by her uncle that this horse was so steady that she herself could drive him. She had been told that so many times, and her confidence had been betrayed. But the doctor, since she was like a pale weed grown in the shade, with no stimulus of life except that given at its birth, prescribed fresh air, and to her consternation, daily drives with him. Day after day she went. She dared not refuse, for she was as compliant in her way to a stronger will as the horse. But she went in an agony of terror, of which the doctor had no conception. She sat in the buggy all alone while the doctor visited his patients, and she watched every motion of the horse. If he turned to look at her, her heart stood still. And at last it came to pass that the horse began in a curious fashion to regain something of his lost spirit, and met her fear of him, and became that which she dreaded. One day, as he stood before a gate in late autumn, with the burning gold of maple branches over his head, and the wine of the frost in his nostrils, and this timorous thing seated behind him, anticipating that which he could, but had forgotten that he could do, the knowledge and the memory of it awoke in him. There was a stiff northwester blowing. The girl was huddled in shawls and robes. Her little pale face looked forth from the midst with wide eyes, with a prospectus of infinite danger from all life in them. Her little thin hands clutched the reins with that consciousness of helplessness and conviction of the horse's power of mischief, which is sometimes like an electric current firing the blood of a beast. Suddenly, a piece of paper blew under the horse's nose. He had been unmoved by firecrackers before, but today, with that current of terror behind him firing his blood, that paper put him in a sudden fury of panic, of self-assertion, of rage, of all three combined. He snorted. The girl screamed wildly. He started. The girl gave the reins a frantic pull. He stopped. Then the paper blew under his nose again, and he started again. The girl fairly gasped with terror. She pulled the reins, and the terror in her hands was like a whip of stimulus to the evil freedom in the horse. She screamed again, and the sound of that scream was the climax. The horse knew all at once what he was. Not the doctor, but a horse, with a great power of blood and muscle, which made him not only his own master, but the master of all weaker things. He gave a great plunge that was rapture, the assertion of freedom, freedom itself, and was off. The faint screams of the frightened creature behind him stimulated him to madder progress. At last he knew, by her terrified recognition of it, his own sovereignty of liberty. He thundered along the road. He had no more thought of his pitiful encumbrance of servitude, the buggy, than a free soul of its mortal coil. The country road was cleared before him. Plodding teams were pulled frantically to the side. Women scuttled into dooryards. Pale faces peered after him from windows. Now and then an adventurous man rushed into his path with wild halloos and a mad swinging of arms, and then fled precipitately before his resistless might of advance. At first, the horse heard the doctor's shouts behind him, and had laughed within himself. Then he left them far behind. He leapt, he plunged. His iron-shod heels touched the dashboard of the buggy. He heard splintering wood. He gave another lunging plunge. Then he swerved and leapt a wall. Finally he had cleared himself of everything except a remnant of his harness. The buggy was a wreck, strewn piecemeal over a meadow. The girl was lying unhurt, but as still as if she were dead. But the horse which her fear had fired to new life was away in a mad gallop over the autumn fields, and his youth had returned. He was again himself, what he had been when he first awoke to a consciousness of existence and the joy of bounding motion in his mighty nerves and muscles. He was no longer the doctor's horse, but his own. The doctor had to sell him. After that his reputation was gone, and indeed he was never safe. He ran away with the doctor. He would not stand a moment unless tied, and then pawed and pulled madly at the halter, and rent the air with impatient whinnies. So the doctor sold him, and made a good bargain. The horse was formed for speed, and his lapse from virtue had increased his financial value. The man who bought him had a good eye for horseflesh, and had no wish to stand at doors on his road to success, but to take a bee-line for the winning post. The horse was well cared for, but for the first time he felt the lash and heard curses. However, they only served to stimulate to a fiercer glow the fire which had awakened within him. He was never his new master's horse as he had been the doctor's. He gained the reputation of speed, but also of vicious nervousness. He was put on the racecourse. He made a record at the county fair. Once he killed his jockey. He used to speed along the road, drawing a man crouching in a tilting gig. Few other horses could pass him. Then he began to grow old. At last, when the horse was old, he came into his first master's hands again. The doctor had grown old, older than the horse, and did not know him at first, though he did say to his old wife that he looked something like that horse which he had owned, which ran away and nearly killed his niece. After he said that, nothing could induce the doctor's wife to ride behind him, but the doctor, even in his feeble old age, had no fear, and the sidelong fire in the old horse's eye, and the proud cant of his neck, and his haughty resentment at unfamiliar sights on the road pleased him. He felt a confidence in his ability to tame this untamed thing, and the old man seemed to grow younger after he had bought the horse. He had given up his practice after a severe illness, and a young man had taken it, but he began to have dreams of work again. He never knew that he had bought his own old horse until after he had owned him some weeks. He was driving him along the country road one day in October, when the oaks were a ruddy blaze, and the sumacs like torches along the walls, and the air like wine with the smell of grapes and apples. Then suddenly, while the doctor was sitting in the buggy with loose reins speeding along the familiar road, the horse stopped, and he stopped before the house, where had used to dwell the man afflicted with old-fashioned consumption, and the window which had once framed his haggard, coughing visage reflected the western sunlight like a blank page of gold. There the horse stood, his head and long neck bent in the old curve. He was ready to wait until the consumptive arose from his grave in the churchyard, if so ordered. The doctor stared at him. Then he got out, went to the animal's head, and man and horse recognized each other. The light of youth was again in the man's eyes as he looked at his own spiritual handiwork. He was once more the master, in the presence of that which he had mastered, but the horse was expressed in body and spirit only by the lines of utter yielding and patience and submission. He was once again the doctor's horse. End of The Doctor's Horse by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman.
Theo and His Horses, Jane, Betsy, and Blanche, by Théophile Gautier, Coffee Break Collection 38, Horses. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Winnifred Assmann. Theo and His Horses, Jane, Betsy, and Blanche. After Théophile grew to be a man, he wrote a great many books, which are all delightful to read, and everybody bought them, and Théophile got rich, and thought he might give himself a little carriage with 2 horses to draw it. And first he fell in love with 2 dear little Shetland ponies, who were so shaggy and hairy that they seemed all mane and tail, and whose eyes looked so affectionately at him that he felt as if he should like to bring them into the drawing-room instead of sending them to the stable. They were charming little creatures, not a bit shy, and they would come and poke their noses into Théophile's pockets in search for sugar, which was always there. Indeed, their only fault was that they were so very, very small, and that, after all, was not their fault. Still, they looked more suited to an English child of 8 years, or to Tom Thumb, than to a French gentleman of 40, not so thin as he once was, and as they all passed through the streets, everybody laughed, and drew pictures of them, and declared that Théophile could easily have carried a pony on each arm, and the carriage on his back. Now Théophile did not mind being laughed at, but still he did not always want to be stared at all through the streets whenever he went out. So he sold his ponies, and began to look out for something nearer his own size. After a short search he found 2 of a dapple grey colour, stout and strong, and as like each other as 2 peas, and he called them Jane and Betsy. But although, to look at, no one could ever tell one from the other, their characters were totally different, as Jane was very bold and spirited, and Betsy was terribly lazy. While Jane did all the pulling, Betsy was quite contented just to run by her side, without troubling herself in the least, and, as was only natural, Jane did not think this at all fair, and took a great dislike to Betsy, which Betsy heartily returned. At last matters became so bad that, in their efforts to get at each other, they half kicked the stable to pieces, and would even rear themselves upon their hind legs in order to bite each other's faces. Théophile did all he could to make them friends, but nothing was of any use, and at last he was forced to sell Betsy. The horse he found to replace her was a shade lighter in colour, and therefore not quite so good a match, but luckily Jane took to her at once, and lost no time in doing the honours of the stable. Every day the affection between the two became greater. Jane would lay her head on Blanche's shoulder. She had been called Blanche because of her fair skin, and when they were turned out into the stable-yard, after being rubbed down, they played together like two kittens. If one was taken out alone, the other became sad and gloomy till the well-known tread of its friend's hoofs was heard from afar, when it would give a joyful neigh, which was instantly answered. Never once was it necessary for the coachman to complain of any difficulty in harnessing them. They walked themselves into their proper places, and behaved in all ways as if they were well brought up, and ready to be friendly with everybody. They had all kinds of pretty little ways, and if they thought there was a chance of getting bread or sugar or melon rind, which they both loved, they would make themselves as caressing as a dog. Nobody who has lived much with animals can doubt that they talk together in a language that man is too stupid to understand. Or, if anyone had doubted it, they would soon have been convinced of the fact by the conduct of Jane and Blanche when in harness. When Jane first made Blanche's acquaintance, she was afraid of nothing, but after they had been together a few months, her character gradually changed, and she had sudden panics and nervous fits, which puzzled her master greatly. The reason of this was that Blanche, who was very timid and easily frightened, passed most of the night in telling Jane ghost stories, till poor Jane learned to tremble at every sound. Often, when they were driving the lonely alleys of the Bois de Boulogne after dark, Blanche would come to a dead stop, or shy to one side as if a ghost, which no one else could see, stood before her. She breathed loudly, trembled all over with fear, and broke out into a cold perspiration. No efforts of Jane, strong though she was, could drag her along. The only way to move her was for the coachman to dismount and to lead her, with his hand over her eyes for a few steps, till the vision seemed to have melted into air. In the end, these terrors affected Jane just as if Blanche, on reaching the stable, had told her some terrible story of what she had seen, and even her master had been known to confess that when, driving by moonlight down some dark road where the trees cast strange shadows, Blanche would suddenly come to a dead halt and begin to tremble, he did not half like it himself. With this one drawback, never were animals so charming to drive. If Théophile held the reins, it was really only for the look of the thing, and not in the least because it was necessary. The smallest click of the tongue was enough to direct them, to quicken them, to make them go to the right or to the left, or even to stop them. They were so clever that in a very short time they had learned all their master's habits, and knew his daily haunts as well as he did himself. They would go of their own accord to the newspaper office, to the printing office, to the publishers, to the Bois de Boulogne, to certain houses where he dined on certain days in the week, so very punctually that it was quite provoking. And if it ever happened that Théophile spent longer than usual at any particular place, they never failed to call his attention by loud neighs or by pawing the ground, sounds of which he quite well knew the meaning. But alas, the time came when a revolution broke out in Paris. People had no time to buy books or to read them. They were far too busy in building barricades across the streets, or in tearing up the paving stones to throw at each other. The newspaper in which Théophile wrote, and which paid him enough money to keep his horses, did not appear any more, and sad though he was at parting, the poor man thought he was lucky to find someone to buy horses, carriage, and harness, for a fourth part of their worth. Tears stood in his eyes as they were led away to their new stable, but he never forgot them, and they never forgot him. Sometimes, as he sat writing at his table, he would hear from afar a light, quick step, and then a sudden stop under the windows, and their old master would look up and sigh, and say to himself, "Poor Jane, poor Blanche, I hope they are happy." End of Theo and His Horses, Jane, Betsy, and Blanche, by Théophile Gautier.
The Undertaker's Horse, by Rudyard Kipling. Coffee Break Collection 38, Horses. Recording by Larry Wilson. Though Chin Shu is condemned to death, how can he drink tea with the executioner? Japanese proverb. The eldest son bestrides him, and the pretty daughter rides him, and I meet him oft mornings on the course, and there kindles in my bosom an emotion chill and gruesome, as I canter past the Undertaker's horse. Neither shies he nor is restive, but a hideously suggestive trot, professional and placid, he affects. And the cadence of his hoof-beats to my mind this grim reproof beats. Mend your pace, my friend. I'm coming. Who's the next? Ah, stud-bred of ill omen, I have watched the strongest go. Men of pith and might and muscle at your heels, down the plantain-bordered highway. Heaven send it ne'er be my way, in a lacquered box and jetty upon wheels. Answer, sombre beast and dreary, where is Brown, the young, the cheery? Smith, the pride of all his friends, and half the force. You were at the last dread dock, we must cover at a walk. Bring them back to me, O Undertaker's horse. With your mane unhogged and blowing, and your curious way of going, and that business-like black crimping of your tail, e'en with beauty on your back, sir, pacing as a lady's hack, sir. What wonder when I meet you I turn pale? It may be you wait your time, beast, till I write my last bad rhyme, beast. Quit the sunlight, cut the rhyming, drop the glass. Follow after with the others, where some dusky heathen smothers us with marigolds in lieu of English grass. Or, perchance, in years to follow, I shall watch your plump sides hollow, see Carnifex, gone lame, become a corse, see old age at last o'erpower you, and the station pack devour you. I shall chuckle then, O Undertaker's horse. But to insult, gibe, and quest, I've still the hideously suggestive trot that hammers out the unrelenting text, and I hear it hard behind me, in what place soe'er I find me, sure to catch you sooner or later. Who's the next? End of poem. This recording is in the public domain.
The White Horse Girl and the Blue-Wind Boy by Carl Sandburg. Coffee Break Collection 38. Horses. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tom Merritt. The White Horse Girl and the Blue-Wind Boy. When the dishes are washed at night time, and the cool of the evening has come in summer, or the lamps and fires are lit for the night in winter, then the fathers and mothers in Rutabaga country sometimes tell the young people the story of the White Horse Girl and the Blue-Wind Boy. The White Horse Girl grew up far in the west of the Rutabaga country. All the years she grew up as a girl, she liked to ride horses. Best of all things for her was to be straddle of a white horse, loping with a loose bridle among the hills and along the rivers of the west Rutabaga country. She rode one horse white as snow, another horse white as new-washed sheep wool, and another white as silver, and she could not tell because she did not know which of these three white horses she liked the best. Snow is beautiful enough for me any time, she said. New-washed sheep wool or silver out of a ribbon of the new moon. Any or either is white enough for me. I like the white manes, the white flanks, The white noses. The white feet of all my ponies. I like the forelocks hanging down between the white ears of all three. My ponies. And living neighbor to the white horse girl in the same prairie country, with the same black crows flying over their places, was the blue-wind boy. He liked to walk with his feet in the dirt and the grass, listening to the winds. Best of all things for him was to put on strong shoes and go hiking among the hills and along the rivers of the West Rutabaga country, listening to the winds. There was a blue wind of daytime, starting sometimes 6 o'clock on a summer morning or 8 o'clock on a winter morning. And there was a night wind, with blue of summer stars in summer, and blue of winter stars in winter. And there was yet another, a blue wind of the times between night and day, a blue dawn and evening wind. All three of these winds he liked so well, he could not say which he liked best. The early morning wind is strong as the prairie, and whatever I tell it, I know it believes and remembers, he said. And the night wind, with the big dark curves of the night sky in it, the night wind gets inside of me and understands all my secrets. And the blue wind of the times between, in the dusk, when it is neither night nor day, this is the wind that asks me questions and tells me to wait, and it will bring me whatever I want. Of course, it happened as it had to happen. The white horse girl and the blue wind boy met, she straddling one of her white horses, and he wearing his strong hiking shoes in the dirt and the grass. It had to happen they should meet among the hills and along the rivers of the West Rutabaga country, where they lived neighbors. And of course she told him all about the snow-white horse, and the horse white as washed sheep wool, and the horse white as silver ribbon of the new moon. And he told her all about the blue winds he liked listening to, the early morning wind, the night sky wind, and the wind of the dusk between, the wind that asked him questions and told him to wait. One day the two of them were gone. On the same day of the week, the white horse girl and the blue wind boy went away, and their fathers and mothers and sisters and brothers and uncles and aunts wondered about them and talked about them, because they didn't tell anybody beforehand they were going. Nobody at all knew beforehand or afterward why they were going away, the real, honest why of it. They left a short letter. It read, "To all our sweethearts, old folks and young folks, we have started to go where the white horses come from and where the blue winds begin. Keep a corner in your hearts for us while we are gone. The white horse girl, the blue wind boy." That was all they had to guess by in the West Rutabaga country, to guess and guess where two darlings had gone. Many years passed. One day there came riding across the Rutabaga country a gray man on horseback. He looked like he had come a long ways. So they asked him the question they always asked of any rider who looked like he had come a long ways. "Did you ever see the white horse girl and the blue wind boy?" "Yes," he answered. "I saw them. It was a long, long ways from here I saw them," he went on. "It would take years and years to ride to where they are. They were sitting together and talking to each other, sometimes singing, in a place where the land runs high and tough rocks reach up, and they were looking out across the water, blue waters far as the eye could see, and away far off the blue waters met the blue sky. 'Look,' said the boy, 'that's where the blue winds begin.' And far out on the blue waters, just a little this side of where the blue winds began, there were white manes, white flanks, white noses, white galloping feet. 'Look,' said the girl, That's where the white horses come from. And then nearer to the land came thousands in an hour, millions in a day. White horses, some white as snow, some like new washed sheep wool, some white as silver ribbons of the new moon. I asked them, "Whose place is this?" They answered, "It belongs to us. This is what we started for. This is where the white horses come from. This is where the blue winds begin." And that was all the gray man on horseback would tell the people of the West Rutabaga country. That was all he knew, he said, and if there was any more, he would tell it. And the fathers and mothers and sisters and brothers and uncles and aunts of the white horse girl and the blue wind boy wondered and talked often about whether the gray man on horseback made up the story out of his head, or whether it happened just like he told it. Anyhow, this is the story they tell sometimes to the young people of the West Rutabaga country, when the dishes are washed at night, and the cool of the evening has come in summer, or the lamps and fires are lit for the night in winter. End of The White Horse Girl and the Blue Wind Boy by Carl Sandburg.
Wild Horses by Edouard Louis Trouessart. Coffee Break Collection 38, Horses. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Beeswaxcandle. Wild Horses. The primitive stock of the domestic horse has until recently been considered wholly extinct. A few more or less numerous herds of horses called tarpans are living in a state of freedom in the steppes of Central Asia, but they are the descendants of domestic horses that have become wild, and do not differ much more from the domestic races of the same country than the half-wild horses of the Landes and of La Camargue in the south of France differ from the horses of Tarbes or the Pyrenees. There are also found in the Asiatic steppes bands of really wild animals, the Hermiones, onagras, or fertile mules of the ancients, which are not true horses, but, notwithstanding their shorter ears, more resemble the ass and mule. They are widely scattered in Asia and form three distinct species, of which the best known is the Indian Hermione, Equus hermionus, var. Onager, the onagra of Pallas and the ancients, the Gaur Kur of the Hindus, the Gur or Kertekt of the Persians, and the Kulan of the Kirghiz, a species common in zoological gardens where it is easily bred. It inhabits the Kutch or Indian desert and the steppes of Turkestan, where the caravans going from Persia to Yarkand often meet numerous droves of these animals. Farther north and east, on the central plateau of Asia, lives the Hermione of Tibet, Equus hermionus proper, the Kiang or Diskektai of the Tibetans, which much resembles the preceding animal. Then, in the southwest, in the desert of Syria and the north of Arabia, is found the Hemippus, Equus hemippus or E. herminus syriacus, with shorter ears and more elegant forms than the preceding animals. Professor Henri Milne-Edwards was of the opinion that the three races of Hermione were only local varieties of a single species, Equus hermionus. North of the central plateau of Asia, the steppes of Turkestan are prolonged so as to form the desert of Gobi, and again farther east into the desert of Dzungaria. This region, situated immediately south of Siberia, from which it is separated by the valley of the Amur, and north of the Tian Shan Mountains, which separate it from China, remained almost entirely unexplored till the time when it passed from the dominion of the Chinese to that of the Russians. In this desert region, the celebrated traveller Przhevalsky discovered in 1881, during his last journey into Central Asia, a wild horse, distinct from both the tarpan and from the different varieties of the Hermione. The wild horses of this species, called Kertag by the Kirghiz and Taki by the Mongols, live in small herds from 5 to 15 individuals, under the direction of an old stallion. They are very suspicious, and rarely allow themselves to be approached within gunshot. They are extremely swift and easily escape the best mounted hunters. After several fruitless pursuits, Przewalski succeeded in bringing down a 3-year-old stallion, whose remains are now to be seen in the Museum of the Academy of Sciences of St. Petersburg, and which is the type of the Equus Przewalski of the naturalist Poliakov. The wild horse of Dzungaria is an animal the size of the Hermione and more robust in its proportions, in which it resembles the pony. Its head is large, with ears smaller than those of the Hermione, the shoulders thick, especially in the male, the limbs robust and stubbier than those of the Hermiones and the asses. The mane is short and straight, and the moderately long tail is terminated by a tuft of long hairs in much more abundant supply than in the tail of the Hermiones. It has warts on the hind legs as well as on the forelegs, a peculiarity of the horse, distinguishing it from the other species of the genus, which have warts only on the forelegs. The hoofs are full, like those of the horse, and not compressed as in the other species, and the lower parts of the legs are furnished with long hairs falling to the crown of the hoof, a feature which the Hermiones lack. Likewise characteristic is the colour of the pelage, a pale grey, almost white, passing into dun on the head and neck, and blending insensibly on the flanks with the pure white of the belly and the limbs. The mane, the brush of tail, and the long hairs on the lower legs and hoofs are black. There is no trace of the dark dorsal stripe running from the mane to the tail, which is characteristic of the Hermione. The hairy covering is long and undulating, especially in the rigorous winter of that northern region. The external appearance of the animal, as may be inferred from our drawing in Figure 1, is very like that of the small horse or pony. It has been assumed, principally on the ground of the form of the tail, that Przewalski's horse is a Hermione. This opinion does not appear to us tenable. It is evidently found on a begging of the question, because we have so far been ignorant of the real form of the tail of the primitive horse. The study of other wild species of the genus seems to indicate, on the other hand, that the brush form is characteristic of all the wild horses, the plumy tail and mane being acquisitions of domesticity, like the drooping ears of dogs, pigs, and goats. The tail of Przewalski's horse is, however, more brushy than that of the Hermiones. Proofs of another kind are derived from paleontology. There are among the representations of equidae of the Quaternary epoch, engraved by primitive men on reindeer horn and ivory, discovered by Monsieur Piette in the caves of the south of France, some very clearly representing a horse with a brush tail and short ears, like those of the Przewalski horse. Furthermore, the light-coloured and uniform coating, without the dorsal stripe and not separated by a darker tint from the white of the lower parts, the plump shape of the hoofs, and the long hairs of the lower legs, are so many characteristics separating the Przewalski horse from the Hermiones and allying it with the horse. A footnote. According to Herodotus, there were in his time wild horses in Scythia, on the banks of the Hypanis, which were white, like Przewalski's horse. The Asiatic tarpans are never of as clear a colour. End footnote. It is therefore reasonable to assume, with Poliakov, that the wild horse of Dzungaria is the true primitive horse, and represents the original stock of all the domestic races. That naturalist has compared the skull of this horse with those of the remains of horses in the European Quaternary, and has been led to believe in as complete an identity as possible between the two types. We know from the researches of Nehring on the Quaternary fauna of Central Europe that the existing fauna of the Asiatic steppes, which is characterized by the presence of the Saiga, the Jerboa, and the Suslik, extended into Germany and the north of France. Two species of equidae form a part of this fauna, the Hermione, Equus hermionus, and the wild horse, Equus caballus ferus, which is probably identical with Equus Przewalski. The wild horse of Dzungaria is, of all the species of the genus, the one of most northern habitat. This fact explains why the domestic horse supports so well the winters of northern Europe, while the ass is hard to raise in the north of France and cannot live in Sweden. Furthermore, wild horses were still living in the 16th century in the Vosges Mountains, as was said by Elise Rosalyn of Haguenau in a book published at Strasbourg in 1593. Among the animals that are met in the Vosges, first to be noticed, which would be a marvel in many countries, are the wild horses. They keep in the forests and the mountains, providing their own support and breeding and increasing at all seasons. In winter, they hunt for a shelter on the rocks, feeding like large game on the brooms, heaths, and branches of trees. They are wilder and more savage than are the deer of many countries, and as hard to capture as they. Men become masters of them, as with the deer, by the aid of the lynx. When they have succeeded in taming and subduing them, a long and difficult task, they have horses of the best quality. These horses withstand the severest cold and are satisfied with the coarsest food. Their walk is sure, their footing firm and solid, because they are accustomed, like the chamois, to run over the mountains and leap the rocks. If the Vosges support wild horses, whilst the Black Forest has no such animals, they owe the privilege to their northern exposure, their sterility, and the prevalence of fierce north winds. Wild horses existed at the same time in the Swiss Alps and in Prussia, Erasmus Stella 1518, and their flesh was eaten as in the Quaternary epoch. Unfortunately, no description or picture of these animals is left us, and although Bishop Fortunat speaks of them as onagras, he was probably speaking of horses that had become wild, the tarpans, and not real wild horses like Equus Przewalski. The engraving we give of the Przewalski horse was made from the type of the species in the Museum of the Academy of Sciences of St. Petersburg, and has been obtained from Professor Eugen Buchner, director of the museum. It is a reproduction of the figure accompanying Polyakov's memoir in the publications of the Russian Imperial Geographical Society. We also give, for comparison, the figure, too, of a species of Hermione, the Syrian Hemippus, Equus hemippus, purposely chosen because it is the species most like the horse in its elegant form and the small size of its ears. This picture is an exact copy of a vellum in the museum, painted from life by Monsieur Bucquot, and represents one of two individuals brought from Damascus in 1855 by Monsieur Bourgoin, which lived for some time at the menagerie of the Paris Museum. Translated for the Popular Science Monthly from La Nature. End of Wild Horses by Edouard Louis Trousseau.